Rabbi wanted to change it. Even Rabbi Yochanan, he said, had he been there at the time that the fast day of Tisha B'Av was declared, he would have suggested it be on the 10th. But Rabbi was born years after the destruction of the Second Temple. There was a precedent already for the observance of the fast of Av and being on the 9th of Av, not on the 10th of Av. So how is it that Rabbi wanted to change the date? And this question manifests itself in a double form. First of all, by what right Rabbi wanted to change it? We know, as Tosfos points out himself, one Bezdin cannot go against something that was decided and implemented by another Bezdin unless it's greater in knowledge. And since all the previous Batei Dinim of the previous generations observed the fast of Av on the 9th, how could Rabbi, by what right did Rabbi have to be able to change the date of the fast? And then the second question is, why would he want to change it after it's been practiced that way? Now, by what right? We could explain with a certain yesod that Reb Chaim said in regard to something else. Reb Chaim said, when the prophet talks about the 4 fast days, Tzom HaRevi, the fast of the 4th month, which is Tammuz, Shavasa B'Tammuz, and Tzom HaChamishi, which is Tisha B'Av, the fast of the 5th month, the Tzom HaShvi, which is Tzom Gedalia, the fast of the 7th month, and the Tzom HaSiri, the fast of the 10th month, which is Asara B'Teves. So the Navi, the prophet, only decreed that which month the fast day had to be, but on which day in the month, that the Navi left up to future generations, each generation to decide, the Chachmei HaMasorah, of the generation to decide in which day it should be of that month. The prophet only decided which month it should be, but as far as the day is concerned, they left it up to future generations to decide. Now we have to understand, why did the Nevi'im, why did the prophets make such a decree? To decree which month it should be, but not to decree which day it should be. Seems very strange. Now, I think to understand the Tosfos, we have to understand what is the difference between the 9th and the 10th. The Gemara in Tainus says the 9th was when the fire was first lit, but the 10th was, in a sense, when the overwhelming majority, more than the overwhelming majority, it was lit right before sunset. The day changes with sunset. So, to a large degree, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The temple was destroyed on the 10th. So the question seems to be, should Tisha B'Av be observed when it was destroyed? Or should Tisha B'Av be observed when the fire was first lit? Now, how are we to conceptually understand that? But I think Tisha B'Av has a double component. On one hand, Tisha B'Av is a day of Avelus. It's a day of mourning. And certainly the night of Tisha B'Av and the morning of Tisha B'Av, when there is a custom to sit on the ground, not to sit in regular chairs, emphasizes the mourning aspect of Tisha B'Av. However, there is another aspect to Tisha B'Av, and that is tza'aka, crying out to God for help. Now let's take Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, a lot of the practices of Tisha B'Av apply to Yom Kippur. There are differences. Matter of fact, there is a Hasidic thought as what is the difference between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur, who needs to eat? We rise above the physical world. Tisha B'Av, who can eat? We're overcome with gloom, with sadness, with depression. So Yom Kippur is a holiday, but it's a fast day nevertheless. Why is it? Yom Kippur, Chas v'Shalom, is not a day of mourning. On the contrary, it is a day of joy, of happiness. It gives us a last chance with the heavenly court. But it's a day of tzedakah. It's a day of crying out to God for help. Tisha B'Av is both. On one hand, it's a day of mourning, which is emphasized in the night of Tisha B'Av and the morning part of Tisha B'Av. But Tisha B'Av also is a day of tzedakah. It's a day of crying out to God. And that's emphasized in the mincha service. When we cry out to God in the kriya, which is the same kriya that we have in the other fast days. And we say, Hashem, Hashem, kel rachum v'chanon. We beg for mercy. We know that we are in Golos, we are in exile, and we are in trouble. And we know we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, and we don't have the service that we had at one time. And we cry out to God and ask him to return the service, to rebuild Jerusalem. At Mincha time, we say the Nachem. We ask for consolation. So Tisha B'Av has a double element. And even the fasting component and the other prohibitions of Tisha B'Av can manifest itself in both as a sign of mourning, except for the fasting. Most of the requirements of Tisha B'Av apply to a mourner, someone who lost a close relative. But it's also tzedakah. It's crying out to God. Most of these halachas apply to Yom Kippur, which is a yontif, in which we say Shehechiyanu. So Yom Kippur has this double element. It's mourning over what we lost, and unfortunately what we sometimes continue to lose. And at the same time, it's tzedakah, it's crying out to God for help. We cry out to God for help because of our present situation. We cry out to God for help because we don't have the temple, because we don't sense that same closeness that we had to HaKadosh Baruch Hu generations ago. So now, from the perspective of tzedakah, crying out to God, when would have been the most appropriate time to cry out to God? The most appropriate time to cry out to God would be when the trouble begins. You don't cry out for help when a person is dead. And you don't mourn when he becomes sick. The lighting of the fire that destroyed the temple. The beginning of the trouble was the lighting of the fire. So the 9th of Av represents the idea we are in trouble more than the 10th of Av. The 10th of Av, when the Beis Hamikdash became completely destroyed, in a sense, that represents the idea of mourning. We mourn when a person dies, after the fact is completed. And I think this is what Rabbi, in other words, he agreed with what Rabbi Yochanan would have done, but perhaps for a little different reason. Rabbi felt that in the early years after the Churban, after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, so the Jewish people were in trouble. Rome oppressed the Jews. Jews were murdered. And Tisha B'Av was both. While it was both, it was crying out for help, and it was mourning. It was primarily crying out for help because of the oppression that the Jews were undergoing. The blood of the Jews became worthless. Rabbi was practically 100 years after the Churban. So it was the Rabbi. So Rabbi felt that initially it was appropriate for the fast to be on the 9th of Av, because the Jewish people were in such great danger, and they had to cry out because of the oppression against them. But it's brought down that Rabbi had a very good relationship with Antoninus, who was Caesar, who was the leader of Rome. And they had a very good relationship. And at that time, when Rebbe became the Nasi of the Jewish people, the prince of the Jewish people, the leaders of the Jewish people in exile, even though he was in Eretz Yisrael. So Rebbe felt that we no longer had to emphasize the tza'aka aspect, the crying out aspect of Tisha B'Av. But what we had to emphasize, even though that certainly remained, the Beis Hamikdash was not rebuilt, but we had to emphasize the mourning aspect, reflective of the changing situation. Lo hodu lo chachamim, but the chachamim did not agree with him. The chachamim, the other sages, said maybe temporarily the situation is better, but until Mashiach comes, until the ultimate redemption will take place, the situation is likely to change. And because of that, Rebbe's suggestion that the fast be changed to the 10th was not accepted.
Before we go on for a second, we forgot the dedication at the beginning of the share.
No, so that's next week.
Oh, it's next week? Okay.
That's the day of the day. That's the day of the.
Okay. Sorry.
The day of the Earth site. Okay, so but and it's interesting. The Ritva brings down. It's saying that it's possible that Rebbe wanted to change it not from the 9th to the 10th, but from the 9th to the 11th. And the question is, why should he have wanted to change it to the 11th? And the answer is because the 9th, that was the day, the last moments of the 9th when the fire was started. The 10th, the Beis HaMikdash burned completely. The 11th, we didn't have the Beis HaMikdash. And Rebbe felt for the early generations, after the Churban, after the destruction, so what was relevant was the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, or the situation that they found themselves in. But he felt that for later generations, and he saw himself as being the leader of the later generations. Our concern has to focus not so much on the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, but the fact that we don't have the Beis HaMikdash. It's interesting, not that that is directly relevant, but the Rogatchover, he asks a question. It's a famous question. On one hand, we say that everybody is required to participate in the building of the Beis HaMikdash, men, women. And on the other hand, we say, "Ein bonim Beis HaMikdash b'layla." The Beis HaMikdash cannot be built at night. It can only be built in the day. And the question is asked. So it's a mitzvah that's dependent upon time. And the general rule is that a mitzvah that is dependent upon time, women are not required. So how could we on one hand say, "Ein bonim Beis HaMikdash b'layla," the Beis HaMikdash cannot be built at night? And on the other hand, we say that women are required in the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. There are many answers. But the Rogatchover suggests that the building of the Beis HaMikdash, that's only the act of the mitzvah. The fulfillment of the mitzvah is in having a Beis HaMikdash. And the mitzvah of having a Beis HaMikdash is both in the day and at night. Consequently, women are required in the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, because whether the mitzvah is based on time or not is based on the fulfillment of the mitzvah, not in the action of the mitzvah. In other words, the mitzvah of Asuli Mikdash, you shall make for me a Mikdash, is fulfilled in having a Beis HaMikdash. But even without that, the Beis HaMikdash represented the perpetuation of Matan Torah. There, a Jew would go and feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, feel close to God. And Rabbi felt that for later generations, the actual destruction of the Beis HaMikdash perhaps is a little less relevant. What we have to emphasize is the tragedy of not having the Beis HaMikdash. And the 11th day, the 11th of Av, more than the 9th and the 10th, represents that idea of not having, as opposed to seeing the destruction. Now, the truth of the matter is, these two components of Tisha B'Av, of crying out to God on one hand, of tza'aka, and avelus and mourning, represent two different trips. that the Jewish people take throughout exile. I mentioned when the share about Sfiras Omer, about Shechiyanu, that the Baal HaTurim says that the Baal HaTurim says the Baal HaTurim says that the Jewish people that the word Lech Lecha in the Torah is mentioned twice. It's mentioned Lech Lecha in the command given to Avram to leave his father's house and to go to the land of Israel. Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'moladecha me'beis avicha el haaretz asher areka. Go to that land that I'll show you. On the other hand, it's mentioned at the time of the Akedah, at the time of the binding of Isaac, when Abraham got the command from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from God, to take his only son Isaac to the land of Moriah, which according to our sages was Jerusalem, and to put him there on the altar. And he says, the 2 times Lech Lecha, go, is a remez. It's an indication that the Jewish people will be in exile twice. And it's very strange that on one hand, it's a indication, a hint to the fact that the Jewish people will be in exile twice. On the other hand, it's psukim, it's verses that talk about going to the land of Israel and going to Jerusalem. How could verses in the Torah that speak about going to the land of Israel, Lech lecha me'artzecha me'moladcha beis avicha, and the verse speaking about going to Jerusalem, Lech lecha el eretz haMoriah, to the land of Moriah, which is Jerusalem, be an indication about the Jewish people having to leave the land of Israel and Jerusalem twice? It seems to be contradictory. But the answer is that the Jewish people that view Gullus, have to view exile from 2 perspectives. One perspective is to see Eretz Yisrael, to see Gullus, exile, as a trip away from Jerusalem, as a trip away from the land of Israel. Galinu ma'atzenu, we went to exile from the land. Galinu ma'atzenu, because of our sins, because of our sins. We went into exile. And we came far from our land. On the other hand, the trip towards Eretz Yisrael, but the exile is also a trip towards Eretz Yisrael and towards Jerusalem. It's brought down that Rabbi Ber Leibowitz, the Bir Hashmuel, that on Purim, he was always in a very happy mood. And he would line up all the boys in his yeshiva, and they would form, in those days in the European towns, everybody was train oriented, because that's how people went from one town to the other. There were cars, but it's not like today that everybody had a car. And there probably were some planes also, but it wasn't something that was used on a regular basis. So the symbol of travel was the train. And the boys would line up, each putting their hands on the shoulder of the one in front of them. And Rabbi Ber Leibowitz, he would be like the engineer of the train. And he would make noise like a train, choo-choo. And he would mention the different areas that the Jewish people went through their exile. I think the last place would be America. It's based on something that Reb Chaim Volozhin said. And the last stop would be Jerusalem. That would be the final destination. What was he emphasizing? He was emphasizing that exile is not just a trip away from Yerushalayim, but it's a trip toward Yerushalayim as well. And the element of tza'aka on one hand and avelus, I think, represents these two trips that we simultaneously take. On one hand, we see ourselves in the journey away from Jerusalem, in the journey away from Israel. On the other hand, we see ourselves in the journey towards Israel and towards Jerusalem. And I think there is a custom not to say Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. Tachanun is a prayer where we beg God for mercy. And it's a prayer that is not said on holidays. So it seems very odd that we do not say Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. After all, there is no sadder day than Tisha B'Av. Now, it's true that our sages tell us that all the fast days eventually will become holidays. But Shavasa B'Tammuz, Asara B'Teves, and so on, Gedalia, which are the other fast days commemorating the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we do say Tachanun. So why is it that Tisha B'Av, which is the saddest of the days, we don't say Tachanun? But I think perhaps because there's a Gemara, the Gemara tells us that Tisha B'Av, it's mentioned the whole story, but the Tisha B'Av is the day that the Mashiach is born. What does it mean the Mashiach is born? Mashiach's not going to be 2,000 years old. What does it mean Mashiach is born? Well, what I think it means, and it's talking about the original Tisha B'Av, the Tisha B'Av when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The Gemara is very explicit about that. But what it means is that the trip away, the trip towards Yerushalayim and towards Eretz Yisrael began the moment the trip away from Yerushalayim and away from Eretz Yisrael began. And in a sense, Avelos mourning, that has to do with seeing Tisha B'Av, with seeing ourselves in the trip away from Yerushalayim. But Tza'aka, when we cry out for help from God, and we say, Nachem Hashem at Mincha, there the focus begins to change. It's not just mourning, it's not just a trip away from Yerushalayim, it's a trip towards Yerushalayim. So Tisha B'Av as a day commemorates both. Consequently, it's considered a holiday. Moed. Why is it a moed? It's a moed not just because eventually it'll be a holiday. It's a moed because more than any of the other days, it represents the beginning of the trip back to Yerushalayim and back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, many years ago, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe's wife passed away, my father went to Menachem Ovel, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And at that time, my father mentioned to the Lubavitcher Rebbe a thought from Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Chaim Volozhiner said, Kol hamisabel al Yerushalayim, whoever mourns over Jerusalem, zoche v'roa b'nechamasa, merits and sees in the consolation of Yerushalayim. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner asked the question, it should have said, will merit and will see in the consolation of Jerusalem. What do you mean, zoche v'roa b'nechamasa? He merits and sees in the consolation of Jerusalem, in the present tense. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner said, my father said, that the nechama is now. It's not something just of the future. And I think it's expressive of the same idea that I was saying, that simultaneously we are in a journey away from Jerusalem and we are on a journey towards Jerusalem. And at that time, the Lubavitcher Rebbe assumed, and I think that Reb Chaim Volozhiner meant that also, that Reb Chaim Volozhiner meant to say that when we are misabel, when we mourn for Jerusalem, because in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, there is a belief that just like there is a Beis HaMikdash, there is a temple down on earth, corresponding to it, there is a temple in heaven. And the temple on earth, Reb Chaim Volozhiner emphasizes this very much in the Nefesh HaChaim. The temple on earth could not be destroyed until the temple in heaven was destroyed. And he goes on to say the temple on earth was destroyed by the Babylonians and by the Romans. But the temple in heaven was destroyed by the deeds or the misdeeds of the Jewish people. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that Reb Chaim Volozhiner obviously meant that when we are misabel on Yerushalayim, when we mourn over Jerusalem, in a sense, we are contributing to the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash in heaven, which will allow for the building of the Beis HaMikdash down on earth. And he said to my father, but we need a nechama, we need a consolation down here on earth also. And my father said to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think what Reb Chaim Volozhiner said didn't just apply in the upper worlds. It applied in the lower worlds also down here on earth. When we are misabel on Jerusalem, so to a certain degree, when we are misabel on Jerusalem, there is a nechama. There's a beginning of a nechama down here on earth as well. And I want to explain this idea only because I've seen some very disturbing things written in the name of Dali Yisrael. And let me say right at the outset that I don't believe that they said it. They might have said something that was not intentionally misunderstood, but nevertheless misunderstood. The Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, at the end of Hilchos Malachim, says that a person has to believe in the coming of Mashiach. And the person it's one of the 13 fundamental beliefs. But the Rambam says it's not enough to believe in the coming of Mashiach. You have to be mechaker l'biyaso. You have to wait for his coming. What does it mean to wait for his coming? What does it mean? And there is but in other words, we have to look forward every day. Maybe Mashiach will come today. It doesn't mean that Mashiach necessarily will come today. You don't have to go around with a beeper that someone should notify you if they heard that Mashiach came. That's not what it meant. But we have to know that Mashiach could come today. And when we look at the events of the world, let's take our generation. A generation that saw the Jewish people taking control of their land, perhaps not in the way we would have wanted. A generation that saw the fall of the Soviet Empire. Who could have believed 40 years ago that the Soviet Empire would crumble? But strange things happen. So we have to look forward to Mashiach coming today. Doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to come today. Doesn't even mean that he's likely going to come today. But we have to believe that it's possible. My uncle, in the Al Tshuva, he mentions a very beautiful piece. He mentions that one hand, the Rambam paskins, Ein Yisrael Negolim B'Tshuva. The Jewish people are not going to be redeemed except with Tshuva. On the other hand, we have to look forward to Mashiach's coming. How is it possible? My uncle said, our faith in the coming of Mashiach is grounded in our faith in the Jewish people. We have to believe that the Jewish people can do tshuva soon, right away. Doesn't seem logical. It doesn't seem likely. But we have to want it. And we can't say we want it if we don't believe it could happen. Mechake lepiyaso. And it's so strange to me. It's so strange to me. You know, Lubavitch Rabbi very much pushed the idea of Mashiach coming. And they even had a song, We Want Mashiach Now. And I don't know that you have to have all these posters about it. But, and I remember as a young boy, in all the yeshivas, I can't say all the yeshivas, I wasn't in all the yeshivas, but I very often saw at Shalashudas in yeshivas, there was a song they used to sing, Zol Shein Zayin de Gula, Mashiach Zol Shein Kumen. They should, the redemption should take place right away. Shein. Mashiach should come right away. Then all of a sudden, after Lubavitch started singing, We Want Mashiach Now, we no longer hear that song in the yeshivas. There was a custom, Tisha B'Av, when you left the shul in Europe. Here, the Sfarim are too expensive. But in Tisha B'Av, the kinnis were very small booklet. When they left the shul, Tisha B'Av, they would put the kinnis in Sheamus, in order to indicate we're not looking forward to saying Kinnis next year. What did that indicate? That indicated we believe that Mashiach, that there won't be another fast day of Tisha B'Av. There won't be another day of mourning of Tisha B'Av. How could somebody say in the name of Gdolei Yisrael that Mashiach isn't going to come now? We have to be prepared for that eventuality. Everybody knows the story of Rabbi Yitzchak Barditcheva. Rabbi Yitzchak Barditcheva, Rabbi Yitzchak Barditcheva, when he sent out an invitation, okay, if we would do it, it might be Yura. But for Rabbi Yitzchak Barditcheva, it was not Yura. When he sent out an invitation to his children's wedding, he would write that the wedding will take place in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. But if Chas v'Shalom Mashiach doesn't come, it'll take place somewhere else. So in other words, the traditional approach was, we're looking forward to Mashiach coming very soon. You know, when the state of Israel was established, so at that time there was a big argument whether it's a Schalta de Gula or not a Schalta de Gula, beginning of the redemption or not the beginning of the redemption. And be honest, I didn't know what the whole argument was about. There were those that were fiercely opposed to see it as the beginning of redemption. I think that many of those that were so opposed, why were they so opposed? Who cares? Because they thought that would lead to the idea that the beginning of the redemption, at the end, will be the whole redemption. It'll lead to see Ben Gurion as Mashiach. That's why they were so fierce about it. What's unfortunate today is that many of these people don't talk about Mashiach anymore. What did we gain? We're opposed because we were scared that it'll lead to people not believing in Mashiach. But if the reason they believed in Mashiach was because they saw the state of Israel being a step in the process towards Eretz Yisrael, at least there was a belief in the coming of Mashiach. Today we don't hear people talking about that anymore. This is the idea, it's a nechama now. And it's a nechama now. What do you mean? What does it mean? Zoche v'roeh b'nechamasa. That you see in the present, down on earth, you see a consolation. When you look at the events of the day, when you see the survival of the Jewish people from the Holocaust, just as Rabbi Akiva, when he saw Shul Yotzei Miyush from the base Kodesh Kadoshim, he able biyadua. Yadua doesn't just mean I know, but Yadua means experience. Yisod haYisodos v'amud hachokmos leidas yesh hamotzer rishon. The Rambam doesn't say you believe in the existence of God who created the world. Leida, what does Leida mean as opposed to Muna? Leida means to experience God. My uncle said, You see the sunrise. You don't just see the sunrise. You see God raising the sun. So we have to experience the coming of Mashiach. And when we're at Soloveichik on Tisha B'Av, Jews throughout the generations would say, B'mheira b'yameinu, speedily in our days. What does speedily in our days mean? 100 years from now. So in other words, Tzaka represents this idea that we're looking forward for a salvation right now. We're not just looking forward for a salvation from Iran. Of course, that's part of it. We're looking forward to the salvation of the Jewish people, the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. And I think, to a certain idea, in other words, Rabbi felt, and it's true, that the Tisha B'Av isn't just limited to the historical event of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and all the fast days. It has to do with the events that take place through the exile. Consequently, the Chachamim were aware that situations might arise that would necessitate changing the day within a particular month. Like Shavasa B'Tammuz, according to the Talmud Bavli, in the first Beis HaMikdash, the enemies penetrated Yerushalayim on the 9th of Tammuz, later on the 17th of Tammuz. Because of this, the fast day is Shavasa B'Tammuz. Rebbe felt the same thing is true about Tisha B'Av. Not that the dates was any different, although there's one lashon in Yerushalmi that seems to imply that. But the reason is because these fast days is not just focusing on it has to do with the situation that exists. At one time, the situation had to do more with Sa'aka as opposed to Avelus. In Rebbe's mind, later it became Avelus. Consequently, he wanted on the 10th. So, because of this, the Navi only said which month it should be, but the criteria were left up to the Chachamim, the Chachmei HaMasorah of each generation. Of course, today we have no Chachmei HaMasorah. So today, 9th of Av has become the accepted day for all generations until the coming of Mashiach. All right.
Okay, one question. You ended up mentioning it, but the fact that you mentioned that some of the things we do on Tisha B'Av are also what we do on Yom Kippur, so it's like a holiday. You mentioned later that Tisha B'Av is a holiday we don't say Tachanun, but are those 2 points connected? That it's a holiday because we don't wash and pass the knuckle and don't rub on lotions?
I would say differently. No, I wouldn't say that. It's a holiday. It's a holiday because it represents the idea of focusing on the
journey back,
the trip of going back to Yerushalayim and going back to the Beis HaMikdash and going back to Eretz Yisrael.
Okay. Someone asked about when you mentioned the rugged shover about building the Beis HaMikdash at night. Someone asked why mention night. It's not built on Shabbos either, but the Mishkan was built by women.
That's not because of the mitzvah of being in Beis HaMikdash. That's because of the prohibition of Shabbos.
But women worked on building the Mishkan.
That's correct. But the mitzvah is the same mitzvah. That matter of fact, the Rambam says that the women are required in building the Beis Hamikdash as they were required in the building of the Mishkan. I would suggest, according to the Rogatchover, I have different approach to that. Could be in Parshas Truma, we'll discuss it. But but my guess is that according to the Rogatchover, since the building of the Mishkan and the building of the Beis Hamikdash is all one mitzvah, so women are required because it's a mitzvah saseh she'ein hazman grama, because it's the mitzvahs in having it. It's a mitzvah in having it. The fulfillment of the mitzvah is having it. So, and that's all the time. And the Mishkan is part of that same mitzvah. It seems that according to the Rogatchover, the building is part of, in regard to the Mishkan, in the Midbar, in the desert, not in Eretz Yisrael, the building of the Mishkan was part of having the Mishkan. But that's something that would have to be discussed in Parshas Truma. Okay.
Someone, I think you discussed this last week, so they're trying to connect last week to this week. Can we relate the machlokas between Rabbi and the Chachamim about Tza'aka to the machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban about the davening when you're in trouble?
Well, I would suggest that Tisha B'Av, there is, according to everybody, there is a special mitzvah focusing about the trouble of kindness. It's focusing on the trouble of Golus and the trouble of not having the Beis Hamikdash. Of course, that's always true, but there's a special mitzvah focusing on that trouble on Tisha B'Av. My uncle suggests, but that's again, it has to be another share. My uncle suggests that Tisha B'Av is a day dedicated to all our troubles. And that's why Dvarim Haroim that have nothing to do with Tisha B'Av, let's say Iyov, is permitted. They're permitted to study Iyov on Tisha B'Av because it's Minyana Diyoma. It's something that deals with the theme of the day, because the trouble of the Jewish people, the trouble that the Jewish people have, is somehow Tisha B'Av is dedicated to them. To a certain degree, when we say Nechama and a Beis Avel, we say Hamakom Yinachem Meschem B'Sov Shor Be'utzim Yerushalayim. So even the trouble you have from a private tragedy that seemingly has nothing to do with the Churban is somehow connected to the Churban. Yeah.
Well, so just to follow up, could focusing, acknowledging that we were in trouble then, would that be according to the Ramban? We were
in trouble then, and we are in trouble now, and man will always be in trouble. That's part of Tisha B'Av. Yeah. Okay. That's Iyov. That's why my uncle said that there is you're allowed, even though you're not allowed to learn. But my uncle said in the name of Reb Chaim, anything that has to do with Yana Diyoma, anything that has to do with Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to learn. And when we say you can learn Iyov, even though Iyov doesn't have to do with Tisha B'Av directly, but it has to do with trouble. And Tisha B'Av is dedicated to the idea of the trouble that a Jew has or that man has.
Is there any issue of tzedek hadin for us on the Churban itself? Or tzedek hadin would be for something that was presently happening? I mean, I know the drashos about if the Beis Hamikdash wasn't rebuilt, it's as if it was destroyed in your days. But I mean, part of Iyov recognition was doing tzedek hadin on the tragedies that happened. Do we have to do tzedek hadin for the Beis Hamikdash in our days, or is Tisha B'Av the wrong day to do it? Is that what Tikkun Chatzos is about? Which we don't do.
Tzedek hadin is, well, when we fast, we're fasting for the sins. Part of the fasting is for the sins that led to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So obviously, the fasting itself is a form of a tzedek hadin.
Okay, so the fasting itself is a tzedek hadin. Okay, yeah. I don't fully understand this question, but someone's asking if this has to do with the Beis Hamikdash in the upper world and on this world.
Okay.
I think we need a clarification. I think if according to some concepts, the Beis Hamikdash exists above and it's for us to bring down, how do we reconcile that with the opinion that we destroyed the Beis Hamikdash in the upper world?
Well, so the answer, he's dealing with Rashi and kindness, obviously. Anyway, but the Beis Hamikdash, in other words, Rashi says that the Beis Hamikdash will be brought, will come from heaven. From the Rambam, it doesn't appear that way. The Sfas Emes I heard from my father said, it says, "V'hareinu b'minyanana v'samchenu b'tikuna." In other words, that the Beis Hamikdash as a whole will come down from heaven, but it will still require a tikkun. It will require certain
prefab, and we have to put it together.
I don't know about prefab, but whatever. It will require extra work. So Baharenu will see the binyan Beis Hamikdash. The Samchenu b'tikuna, we're going to fix it. We'll complete the job. So that's how my father once explained it with the Sfas Emes. However, if you want to learn that that's the Pshat and Rashi, we build the Beis Hamikdash up in heaven, and that's the Beis Hamikdash that comes down. Fine, but we could understand it mystically. In other words, that when a person sins, so in the upper worlds they do a certain damage, and there has to be a tikkun on that damage before we can do certain things down on earth. So it's the building of the Beis Hamikdash in heaven that allows us to build the Beis Hamikdash down on earth. Now, what was the question?
I think really that one, according to Rashi, though, that Beis Hamikdash which is built is not the spiritual Beis Hamikdash in the upper world.
The answer to that is I don't know. The answer to that is I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That I don't know.
But I think for this question was being asked, so according to that opinion, the Beis Hamikdash is a physical Beis Hamikdash that will be brought down. And I think according to the Kabbalah and the Nefesh HaChaim, there's a spiritual Beis Hamikdash in the upper world that we can't see, but our actions affect that. And
that's right.
And
that
our world, our physical world is a reflection about the reality in
right.
those upper worlds.
That's right.
Based on our actions.
Yeah, that's right. That's it.
Okay. I don't see any other questions here, but thank you everyone for joining and for your questions. And thank you, Rabbi, for the share. Next week, God willing, same time, same code, same place. I guess will the topic again be Tisha B'Av?
It'll be Tisha B'Av and Nechama and the Shiva the Nechemta.
Okay, so even though it's still before Tisha B'Av, we'll already be looking ahead for Mashiach coming.
Yeah, well, that's what we're supposed to do. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.